everyone, welcome to another episode of Polytalks Environment. And today I would like to discuss an interesting topic, which was the 2023 United States House of Representatives speakership election. Now, for every single election for speaker since 1923, there has been a clear winner on the first draft of the speaker's ballot, and a speaker has been elected on the first ballot. However, this is the first election in over 100 years or actually exactly 100 years, to buck this trend. And today we'll be discussing how this speakership election unfolded and kind of some of the more obscure details in what I would like to call an iceberg. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of an iceberg, it is essentially a way of showing various events, details, facts related to the issue at hand, in this case the speakership election, in a kind of iceberg format. So the first tier here actually represents events that should be obvious to anyone who even read a single news article regarding the speakership election, like very on the surface details that are present. And then as we go down each tier, they become progressively more obscure until some of these events at the bottom are either obscure to the average person tuning into the speakership election, or it is unrelated at first how they are exactly related to the speakership election, although there is a connection. So I just want to dive right in, and we're going to start with the first tier. As I mentioned, very on the surface details, so I'll very briefly skim over this. Essentially, this was an election between Kevin McCarthy and Hakeem Jeffries, and Kevin McCarthy had previously won the Republican vote for Republican nominee, and Hakeem Jeffries had won the Democratic vote pretty much unanimously, whereas Kevin McCarthy's vote was not. And these two were competing for opposite parties to become speaker. Now, unlike regular elections, or actually similar to many regular elections, these are not the only two candidates that can be voted for. You can vote for, these representatives could vote for another person if they were nominated, and that actually happened many, many times. And we will be discussing today the various people that have been nominated and how that affected the result. But the point is, this is not simply a plurality vote. In fact, if it was a plurality vote, Hakeem Jeffries very likely would have won the speakership election had the vote gone the exact same way. Rather, it is a 218 to win style, so Kevin McCarthy needed 218 votes to win, or any candidate needs 218 votes to win, assuming, and this will be important later, that the majority of members present and voting is 218. So there were at least 434 members voting, because a majority of 434 is 218, and that also actually applies to 435 as well as 434. And as a matter of fact, there were 434 members voting for at the most for all the votes, and I will explain why later. But that was the very threshold McCarthy needed to reach, and he did not reach that for quite a long time, so we'll be diving into that today. So that is the basic first tier, essentially the very basics of how the speakership election works and the candidates participating in it. Now we get into many of the still on the surface but a little more obscure details, such as the concessions McCarthy had to make to become speaker. Now it's pretty clear how this was related to the election, because these concessions were necessary to win over hard-line Republican support and eventually elect McCarthy as speaker. And as covered, the main concession that McCarthy had to make was lowering the threshold for instigating a motion to vacate the chair, to one member instead of 5 members. That's right, any single member of the United States House of Representatives that is a Republican can initiate a motion to vacate the chair, which, if you're not familiar with, is essentially a vote of no confidence, meaning that I believe if a majority of Republicans agreed to it, then McCarthy would be ousted as Speaker. So only one person in the Republican conference uh, needs to instigate a motion to vacate the chair, and then a vote will take place. So that gives members such as Matt Gaetz, who have some disagreements with McCarthy, a huge amount of political leeway. Now, there are other concessions as well, and there was recently a rule package in which McCarthy essentially gave away much of the power of his speakership in order to even be elected in the first place. So, moving on here, we have the death of Donald McEachin, and this is quite self-explanatory. Although Donald McEachin was a Democratic representative from Virginia, and shortly after the midterms and before the speakership election, he died at age 61, and that actually did not have any real impact on this race, although it could have, because only one member needs to vote present for the threshold of votes to be lowered to 217, as I will mention later. And it did kind of change some of the thinking, such as Hakeem Jeffries now has one fewer vote, although in the end, this death did not end up having a major impact on the election, although we should not talk about politicians dying as if it is a light matter. This is a very tragic matter. I'm sure both sides can agree on that. And ultimately, even if it had made a difference in the speakership election, this is simply just a tragic event. So we will be moving on from that. And we'll go on to the Never Kevins, and these are the very people that blocked Kevin McCarthy from initially claiming the speakership. They include a group of hard-right House Freedom Caucus members that were attempting to they were advocating for more extreme rules that would allow McCarthy to be ousted much more easily, and as opposed to a challenge from the moderates accusing that Kevin McCarthy was too far to the right, many of these members were claiming that he was too far to the center or simply not a great fit to be the next Speaker of the House. So this included initially around 20 members who voted against McCarthy, but eventually it really narrowed down to 5 or 6 quote-unquote never Kevins that never did once vote for Kevin McCarthy. And even in the last vote, they did indeed vote present, which did give McCarthy the speakership, as I will mention later, but did not count as a direct vote for McCarthy. So that is that tier of the iceberg, and now we start to move into some of the slightly more obscure details, such as the absences. Now, if I go to the Wikipedia page here, we can see that there were some absences right here, such as not voting, and obviously Donald McEachin's death meant there was one absence, permanent absence, although there were others, and almost all of them were from Republicans, such as Ken Buck, and Ken Buck again. And then this was Hunt. So Wesley Hunt of Texas had to leave due to medical procedures. And then the only Democrat to be absent was David Trone here, as you can see. So David Trone was absent again due to a medical procedure, and that resulted in his absence from the. Here we go. This is a better graphic. So absent, medical procedure, and there was Ken Buck, of course, and then there were also Wesley Hunt and Hunt again. So as you can see here, there were quite a few absences, although none of these ended up having an impact on the eventual outcome of the speakership election, although they certainly could have by contributing one fewer vote to McCarthy or against him, and thus lowering the threshold. Now, I've spoken so much about the this threshold, and I want to explain it in more depth. So we will getting into the deeper rules. Now, when I say the Kevin McCarthy and Hakeem Jeffries, either of them would need 218 votes to win. That is a simplification because that is assuming that all 434 members of the House currently sworn in end up voting, which happens several times, but not all times. And essentially how this works is if any member decides to vote either present or if they were absent, then they technically do not count as a vote for this election, which means the threshold for a majority is lower because there are fewer members. So let's take an example. So for the vote Kevin McCarthy won, we can see here, he actually only got 216 votes, and this also happened to Nancy Pelosi 2 years ago in 2021. She also got only 216 votes, but if you take a look here, 6 members of the Never Kevins, as I mentioned earlier, decided to vote present, which is effectively not a vote at all, and that lowered the number of members effectively in the chamber to 428, a majority of which is 215, and that is what McCarthy achieved. And this is actually really fascinating because we were talking about so many different prospects during the speaker vote. McCarthy wanted these members, obviously, to vote present because he knew they probably wouldn't vote directly for him. So he wanted them to vote against him while still giving him a greater chance of winning the speakership. Although the interesting thing is earlier in the vote, when around 20 Republicans voted against McCarthy, actually, if around 10 or 11, I believe, had voted present, then that would have handed the speakership to Hakeem Jeffries, simply because they lowered the threshold so much that 212 was a good amount of votes was the amount of votes required to be elected speaker. So, of course, there was some discussion about all the different possibilities. Well, many of these were far-fetched. It is not inconceivable to see how a significant majority of the Never Kevins could have voted present and handed the speakership to Hakeem Jeffries. So that is a little explanation of the kind of threshold necessary for the speaker election. And the last one on this tier is a little more lighthearted, and it is relating to much online mockery that came as a result of McCarthy moving into the speaker's office before he was speaker, and this drew criticism because, of course, many viewed it as an arrogant move, and he was not officially speaker. If you read the details a little more, it's a little more complicated than that, because technically every other representative had an office, and it has been a tradition in the past for the presumed speaker to assume the speaker's office, although still many were remarking how if McCarthy had not been elected speaker, it would have been a very bad look for him, as he would have had to move his possessions from the office after moving in only days prior. And this list is full of many lighthearted and rather humorous entries that are relatively obscure but are ultimately not massive players or factors in this speakership election. And the first one is let me find it, is a tweet by Congressman Ted Lieu where he is getting ready to go to the House floor and is holding a bag of popcorn. This is quite self-explanatory, but it's kind of a more obscure joke, and it's kind of reflective of the general Democratic mindset of allowing the Republicans to have their dysfunction and internal disagreements and watching it happen in the light. Because ultimately, this entire ordeal harmed Republicans far more than Democrats, even though a Republican speaker was elected. And on the same tune, kind of as popcorn, there were also members of the House, quite a few, that had babies or other children, and many of them posted pictures of them attending to their babies whilst voting on the House floor. And it's simply another example of how Democrats kind of viewed this as a ordeal and really made the most of their time on the speaker's floor, on the House floor while the speakership election was ongoing. And the next is a clip I will play of Matt Rosendale. He actually he pretended initially that he implied initially that he might vote for Kevin McCarthy before ultimately voting for Kevin Hern, and I will let this clip speak for itself.
McCarthy. Rosendale. Kevin. Hern.
So as you can see there, that's another example of how both parties did end up kind of making a mockery out of the speakership election and had some jokes along the way. So those are just some more obscure events that happened that ultimately did not have a massive impact, but they were Easter eggs, if you will, relating to the speakership election. One final example is how McCarthy, as you can see by this clip, had pizza delivered to his office, indicative of a very troublesome Republican night as he was looking for a quick and easy meal, and I find this quite amusing, although, of course, it is not quite related to the speakership vote itself, but rather is another more obscure event. And the final entry on this tier is a little more pertinent to this matter, and it is relating to the votes to adjourn the House. And there were multiple votes to adjourn the House, and all of them passed. And the first one actually was a very narrow margin of passage, although it did end up passing. And Democrats voted strongly against all of these motions, as I will show later in the video. And the coincidental thing was on the last motion to adjourn, which was actually till Monday at 10 a.m. after the 14th vote, which we'll go over next. Republicans initially voted to adjourn before they realized they had the votes for McCarthy to become Speaker, in which case all of the Republicans switched their votes, or most of them, and that resulted in the House not adjourning, and Kevin McCarthy was elected Speaker on the next vote. So it's kind of interesting to see how the politics of adjournment worked, and I think it would have been quite amusing or interesting, actually, to see what would have happened if Democrats had sided with perhaps a few holdout Republicans on the last motion to adjourn and indeed adjourn the House, and see if that would have potentially allowed some room for disagreements to brew and McCarthy to lose support. I do not think this would have ended up happening, but it is quite fascinating to look at how these adjournment votes were political in this way when they ordinarily are practically unanimous. So the next tier begins now with the 14th vote, which was a very it was a fascinating vote for many reasons, but essentially what happened, if I'll show you here, essentially on the 14th vote, there were 432 members voting, of which 217 was needed for a majority, and guess how much McCarthy got? He got exactly 216. And what this meant is McCarthy fell short by one vote, and this could have been a very painful point for McCarthy had he eventually lost more support and had to exit the speakership election. Of course, that did not happen, but it was still fascinating to follow live, as I'm sure most people expected McCarthy to be elected on the 14th vote, and to see him fall short by one vote was simply astounding. And when we get to the Gates-McCarthy altercation later, I will explain one of the key reasons why this vote was so astounding. But it is simply an example of how close and narrow and technical these speakership elections can be. So, we then have the Gates altercation, which is actually in the previous tier, I forgot to mention, but essentially on this 14th vote, Matt Gaetz, he voted present when many expected him to vote for McCarthy and this resulted in an altercation between McCarthy and Gates, in which words were exchanged, and ultimately a GOP representative had to restrain Kevin McCarthy because there was a disagreement, and it was simply an astounding moment and just a feature of how hard these speakership elections can be in terms of whipping votes and the frustrations of McCarthy and the like. So, that was the Gates altercation, and another slightly more humorous aspect of the speakership election was the possibility for a cat to be elected Speaker of the House. This would be a fallback plan in case none of the members of the House could agree on a Speaker, and there had to be simply a nonpartisan, essentially non existent Speaker, so the parties could essentially be decentralized power to committees, and there would be a de facto, there would be no Speaker of the House. Now, of course, this never would have happened, but it was simply an interesting possibility. And reading this fact check article, while there are actually no constitutional limitations for Speaker of the House, which is why Donald Trump received votes on numerous occasions, the elected speaker would have to be sworn in, and because a cat lacks the capabilities to be sworn in, a cat could not, unfortunately, be the Speaker of the House. So that was another fascinating possibility that did sadly not materialize. And another fascinating conversation occurred during the debate on the House was the discussion between Ocasio-Cortez, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Paul Gosar, and this relates somewhat to the C-SPAN freedom seen later in the Iceberg, but these two representatives essentially had a conversation, and this was the subject of much speculation, especially after Gosar had been scrutinized for posting offensive videos regarding Ocasio-Cortez, and this was in reality just a simple conversation regarding a potential deal between Democrats and Republicans, although it was not a secret conspiracy or plan to vote in a different manner. Now, another interesting event occurs on the next tier, and it is related to this conversation, and that is the freedom experienced by C-SPAN. And if I go to the top of this page here and I go down, C-SPAN actually, because there was not a speaker, there were no restrictions really on how to operate, and this allowed C-SPAN much more authority regarding the coverage of the speakership vote, and this was essentially how this conversation was captured, and it allowed much more fiery and many interesting reaction shots, such as the altercation between Matt Gaetz and Kevin McCarthy, to be captured. And C-SPAN has used this as kind of a reason for increased independence for these companies covering the House of Representatives, because typically when there is a speaker in office, and there are restrictions on how C-SPAN can operate within the House. And another interesting moment during the speakership vote was represented by this no, because during one of the votes to adjourn, I believe it was the second or third, all Democrats were unanimously opposed because they wanted the Republicans to keep taking votes that would ultimately undermine the party. And this was simply a humorous moment where Democrats screamed this in union on the voice vote for motion to adjourn, which was more of a symbolic action because it ends up going to a roll call vote anyways, but I simply found this to be another amusing aspect of the speakership election. And the penultimate entry in this list is the immediate consequences of this election dragging on. And while this House was without a speaker, Congress, like this page says, they could not pass bills, adopt resolutions, and in fact, technically, none of the members had been sworn in yet. So technically, all of the members that were voting were not actual representatives because they had not been sworn in yet. And this actually indeed resulted in the second in line for succession being Patty Murray of Washington, the president pro tempore of the Senate. And it also hindered the congressional review period, and there were many consequences as a result of the failure of the House of Representatives to elect a speaker. And last, but very not least, we have George Santos. Now, most people do know about this, although it is not immediately clear how it was related to the speakership race, but indeed, George Santos was or is a United States representative who's been accused of embellishing his record and spreading false claims in his biographies and distorting his true achievements. And this is related to the House vote because these discussions were ongoing during the speakership vote, and this could have drastically changed the math in the House if even one member resigned. And that's why it's so critical that Santos remain in the House for Republicans, which is why ultimately they did not treat him with much scrutiny, although in an ordinary circumstance, many Republicans would be calling for Santos to resign simply because he's a bad outlook for the party. But it's simply another example of how Republicans, especially or almost exclusively the McCarthy-aligned Republicans, were so intent on electing McCarthy as Speaker, they were willing to make multiple concessions and allow the possibility that Republicans be seen as an inferior party due to these Santos scandals here. And that does conclude the complete House Speaker Iceberg for 2023. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this was, in many ways, an amusing video showcasing the many oddities of this particular House election. Many, I know, compared it to a sports game or something along those lines, and it certainly was very reminiscent of that. And this was a House Speaker election that we will not see repeated for a very long time and will stick around in our minds for the foreseeable future. Thank you for tuning into Polytalks. See you later.